Committee will come to order. The committee meets today to hear testimony on the administration's National Defense Strategy and Nuclear Posture Review, both of which were recently released. We welcome back the Secretary of Defense and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to discuss these important documents. I cannot count the number of times I have heard members of this committee talk about the importance of having a defense strategy to help guide decisions that we in the executive branch have to make. Now, we have one. It is a component of the broader national security strategy released in December, and it has within it the Nuclear Posture Review, the first of its kind since 2010. A lot has changed since 2010, and both documents come at a critical time. As the National Security Strategy points out, quote, America's military remains the strongest in the world. However, U.S. advantages are shrinking as rival states modernize and build up their conventional and nuclear forces, end quote. There will undoubtedly be criticism of both documents. Some of it will be based on valid shortcomings. Some of it may spring from more ideological differences. Debates about the particulars are fair and to be expected. But it's also fair, I think, to commend the administration for its attempt to bring structure and rationality to our wide-ranging national security efforts in what is surely a dangerous and volatile world. One last point. We must never forget that with any strategy, the heart of our nation's defense, our most valuable asset, remains the people who serve. It is morally wrong to send brave men and women out on missions under any strategy for which they are not fully trained, equipped, and supported with the best that this country can provide. That support should not be conditioned on any other issue. And we can never forget that there is a real human cost to failing to fully support them. Strategy is important, but nothing is more important for Congress than for us to do our job to support the men and women who protect us, fully and unconditionally. Yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Secretary Mattis, General Selva. I appreciate you both being here. And I very much appreciate the fact that, as the Chairman said, you've put out the National Security Strategy. That is obviously a crucially important step in figuring out how we put together our budget and how the Department of Defense does its job. And I'll start by agreeing with the last point that the Chairman made. I think it is the most important one, and that is whatever our strategy is, whatever it is that we tell the men and women who serve in our military, this is what we expect you to do. It is our paramount obligation to make sure that we fund that we don't have a situation where we give them so many tasks but not enough resources to train for them. I think we can, that is the definition of a hollow force, when we send them into battle unprepared to do what we told them to do. And unfortunately, due to a lot of the budgetary challenges that we've had in the last 6 or 7 years, that's been happening far too often, because we have lurched from continuing resolution to government shutdown to continuing resolution to sometimes an appropriations deal. It is very difficult for both of you and for your predecessors to plan what you're going to do when you don't know how much money you're going to have from 1 week to the next. I think that is a very significant problem. So I appreciate that the strategy is put together. My biggest concern is, does it match the amount of resources that we are likely to have to fund it? We are $21 trillion in debt and counting. The deficit last year was close to $700 billion, and it's going up, not down. So how do we make this fit? How does this work? And then you look at the broader picture, and we just cut taxes by what is going to amount to $2 trillion. The immediate short-term impact of that is that we are going to hit the debt ceiling sooner than we had expected to, because less revenue is coming into the Treasury. So we'll have to go ahead and do that. So in the face of a $21 trillion debt, $700 billion deficit, and all of the needs that the Chairman outlines, and your strategy lays it out, and I think in this committee certainly we all know the list. It's sort of up on the wall over there, minus Iran and the threat from radical Islamist extremisms. Those are the threats that we face, and how do we meet them? In the face of all of that, we decided to give away $2 trillion. And I could make an argument that in so doing, this Congress made a public policy decision that we were not going to fund defense at the levels that this committee thinks they should. We decided not to fund it, and then, okay, well, there's other places we can get the money. But the president has said he is not going to reform mandatory spending at all. The State of the Union address promised more money than I think I can possibly imagine. And as a side note, I think we ought to ban the State of the Union address. And I say that for Democrats and Republicans alike, because the main thing that it does is it gives the executive a chance to stand up there and promise things that are absolutely, utterly, and completely impossible to deliver. And then the American public comes to expect it and rightfully gets a little bit irritated when magic doesn't make it happen. And again, that's bipartisan. Every State of the Union address I've seen since I've been here, I've walked out of there thinking, we don't have that money. What is he talking about? So we need to make improvements on that, to be sure. And I worry greatly about how this strategy is going to be implemented in the face of our debt and our deficits. And if interest rates go up, I mean, we've been incredibly lucky that we've been able to borrow all this money on the cheap. If interest rates go up to 3%, you can forget about all this stuff. And I don't blame that on the defense budget. I understand it's a piece of it. It's 17% of the budget. But our overall budget picture doesn't add up, and I worry that ultimately that will wind up costing the men and women who serve, costing our ability to give them the training and the equipment they need to carry out the missions that we all hear that we need. Last thing I'd say, and what I want to hear is, as I said, we have the list: China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, violent Islamist extremist groups. How do we confront those threats and protect our country? I just want to make a couple quick comments on that. There is a common thread between all of those threats, and that is a threat to representative democracy, freedom, and capitalism. All of those groups want to make the world safe, I guess, for autocratic dictatorships. Now, each one of them has a slightly different viewpoint on what that dictatorship should look like, but it is a fundamental threat to democracy and representative government. And I think we need to understand it in that context and push back comprehensively to try and create a world that is safe for freedom and democracy, because I think that is incredibly important in keeping a peaceful and prosperous world. And lastly, I'm interested in hearing from you. We hear a lot from the military about what you don't have, about where we're not spending enough money, about the threats that we're not meeting. If we're going to get to where we need to go, we need to hear, where can we save money? You know, what part of our national security strategy could we not spend money on? Because if we don't hear places where we can save money, there's no way we're going to have enough money to meet all the places where we're being told that we need it. We need to hear that. I want to say that I think your leadership at DOD and the leadership that came before under Ash Carter has really, and the leadership of the chairman, has done a good job at getting at procurement reform, getting at, trying to get more out of the money that we spend, employing commercial technology, a bunch of different ideas that can enable us to get more for less money. But that is never going to be more important than it is going forward, given the fiscal situation that we are in and given the threat environment that is as described. How do we meet that? So we're going to have to be a lot smarter about how we spend our money, given the situation that we are in. With that, I yield back, and I look forward to your testimony.
Committee is pleased to welcome the Secretary of Defense, Honorable James Mattis, and the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Paul Selva. Gentlemen, thank you for being here. Without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record. Mr. Secretary, you're recognized for any comments you'd like to make.
Well, thank you, Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, and distinguished members of the committee. I'm here at your invitation to testify on two subjects: the 2018 National Defense Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review. And I'm joined by the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Selva. Even in the midst of our ongoing counterterrorism campaigns, my role is to keep the peace for one more year, one more month, one more day, giving Secretary Tillerson and our diplomats time to resolve crises through diplomatic channels. The Department of Defense does this by providing the Commander-in-Chief with military options that ensure our diplomats negotiate from a position of strength. Up front, I need to note 3 days from now I will visit our nation's 1st Security Force Assistance Brigade in Fort Benning, Georgia, as they prepare to deploy to Afghanistan. To advance the security of our nation, these troops are putting themselves in harm's way, in effect signing a blank check payable to the American people with their lives. They do so despite Congress's abrogation of its constitutional responsibility to provide sufficient, stable funding. Our military has been operating under debilitating continuing resolutions for more than 1,000 days during the past decade. These men and women hold the line for America while lacking this most fundamental congressional support, a predictable budget. Congress rightfully mandated this national defense strategy, the first one in a decade, and then shut down the government the day of its release. Today, we are again operating under a disruptive, continuing resolution. It is not lost on me that as I testify before you this morning, we are again on the verge of a government shutdown, or at best, another damaging, continuing resolution. I regret that without sustained, predictable appropriations, my presence here today wastes your time, because no strategy can survive, as you pointed out, Chairman, without the funding necessary to resource it. Yet we all know that America can afford survival. Nations as different as China and Russia have chosen to be strategic competitors. They seek to create a world consistent with their authoritarian models and pursue veto power over other nations' economic, diplomatic, and security decisions. Rogue regimes like North Korea and Iran persist in taking outlaw actions that undermine and threaten regional and global stability. And despite our successes to date against ISIS' physical caliphate, violent extremist organizations continue to sow hatred, incite violence, and murder innocents. Across the globe, democracies are taking notice. We recognize great power competition is once again a reality. We will continue to prosecute the campaign against terrorism by, with, and through our allies. But in our new defense strategy, great power competition, not terrorism, is now the primary focus of U.S. national security. Our military remains capable, but our competitive edge has eroded in every domain of warfare: air, land, sea, cyber, and space. Under frequent continuing resolutions and sequesters budget caps, our advantages continue to shrink. The combination of rapidly changing technology, the negative impact on military readiness resulting from the longest continuous stretch of combat in our nation's history, and insufficient funding have created an overstretched and under-resourced military. During last week's State of the Union address, President Trump said weakness is the surest path to conflict. To those who might suggest that we should accept a year-long continuing resolution, it would mean a return to a disastrous sequestration level of funding for the military. And in a world awash in change and increasing threats, there is no room for complacency. History makes clear that no country has a preordained right to victory on the battlefield. Framed within President Trump's national security strategy and aligned with the Department of State, our 2018 National Defense Strategy provides clear strategic direction for America's military. A long-term strategic competition requires the seamless integration of multiple elements of national power: diplomacy, information, economics, finance, intelligence, law enforcement, and military. The Department's principal priorities are long-term strategic competitions with China and Russia. Given the magnitude of the threats they pose to U.S. security and prosperity today, Congress must commit to both an increased and sustained investment in our capabilities. Concurrently, the Department will sustain its efforts to deter and counter rogue regimes such as North Korea and Iran, defeat terrorist threats to the United States, and consolidate our gains in Iraq and Afghanistan while moving to a more resource-sustainable approach. More than any other nation, America can expand the competitive space. We can challenge our competitors where we possess advantages and they lack strength. To restore a competitive military edge, this defense strategy pursues three primary lines of effort: to build a more lethal force, to strengthen traditional alliances while building new partnerships, and reform the department's business practices for performance and affordability. Our first line of effort emphasizes that everything we do must contribute to the lethality of our military. In war, an enemy will attack a perceived weakness. Therefore, we cannot adopt a single preclusive form of warfare. Rather, we must be able to fight across the spectrum of combat. This means the size and composition of our force matters. The nation must field a sufficient, capable force to deter conflict. If deterrence fails, we must win. To defend our way of life, our military will embrace change while holding fast to traditional proven attributes that make us the most formidable force on any battlefield. Those who would threaten America's experiment in democracy must know, if you threaten us, it will be your longest and worst day. To implement this strategy, we will invest in key capabilities, recognizing we cannot expect success fighting tomorrow's conflicts with yesterday's weapons and equipment. Driven by this strategy, next week you will see in our FY19 budget investments the following: space and cyber, nuclear deterrent forces, missile defense, advanced autonomous systems, artificial intelligence, and professional military education to provide our high-quality troops what they need to win. We will prioritize rebuilding readiness while modernizing our existing force. We will also be changing our force's posture to prioritize readiness for warfighting in major combat, making us strategically predictable for our allies and operationally unpredictable for any adversary. Our second line of effort is to strengthen traditional alliances while building new partnerships. History is clear that nations with allies thrive. We inherited this approach to security and prosperity from the greatest generation, and it has served the United States well for 70 years. Working by, with, and through allies who carry their fair share is a source of strength. Since the costly victory in World War II, Americans have carried a disproportionate share of the global defense burden while others recovered. Today, the growing economic strength of allies and partners has enabled them to step up, as demonstrated by more than 70 nations and international organizations participating in the Defeat ISIS campaign, and again in the 40-some nations standing shoulder to shoulder in NATO's Resolute Support mission in Afghanistan. Most NATO allies are also increasing their defense budgets, giving credence to the value of democracies standing together. Our third line of effort serves as the foundation for our military's competitive edge, reforming the business practices of the department to provide both solvency and security, and thereby gaining full benefit from every dollar spent. Every day we will earn the trust of Congress and the American people. We must be good stewards of the tax dollars entrusted to us. In this regard, we will deliver our department's full financial audit this year, because results and accountability matter. The first audit in DoD's history will reveal how we can be better stewards. The department is transitioning to a culture of performance and affordability that operates at the speed of relevance. We will prioritize speed of delivery, continuous adaptation, and frequent modular upgrades. With your critical support, we will shed outdated management and acquisition processes while adopting American industry's best practices. If current structures inhibit our pursuit of lethality, I expect my service secretaries and defense agency heads to consolidate, eliminate, and restructure to achieve the mission. One of the key elements of the 2018 National Defense Strategy is to ensure America's military provides a safe, secure, and effective nuclear deterrent. Last January, President Trump directed a nuclear posture review to ensure the United States nuclear deterrent is modern, robust, flexible, resilient, ready, and appropriately tailored to deter 21st century threats and reassure allies. I recently received a letter from senators concerned that the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review would undermine decades of U.S. leadership on efforts to reduce and eventually eliminate the existential threat posed by nuclear weapons. To the contrary, the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review reaffirms the mutually reinforcing role of nuclear deterrence in a complex and dynamic security environment, while underscoring continued U.S. commitment to nonproliferation, to counter nuclear terrorism, and to arms control. Specifically, the review reflects the Department of Defense's strategic priority to maintain a safe and effective nuclear deterrent that will successfully deter nuclear and non-nuclear strategic attacks, assure our allies and partners, respond effectively should deterrence fail, and hedge against future uncertainties and dangers. The United States remains committed to its global leadership role to reduce the number of nuclear weapons and to fulfill existing treaty and arms control obligations, leadership that has reduced our nuclear weapons stockpile by over 85% from its Cold War high. Yet we must recognize that deterrence and arms control can only be achieved with a credible capability. A review of the global nuclear situation is sobering. While Russia has reduced only the number of its accountable strategic nuclear force as agreed upon in the New START Treaty, at the same time, Russia has been modernizing these weapons as well as other nuclear systems. Moscow advocates a theory of nuclear escalation for military conflict. China, too, is modernizing and expanding its already considerable nuclear forces, pursuing entirely new nuclear capabilities. It is also modernizing its conventional military to challenge U.S. military superiority. Despite universal condemnation in the United Nations, North Korea's nuclear provocations threaten regional and global peace, and Iran's nuclear ambitions remain an unresolved concern. Globally, nuclear terrorism remains a tangible threat. As Senator McCain said last week, since the end of the Cold War, we have let our nuclear capabilities atrophy under the false belief that the era of great power competition was over. As the new National Defense Strategy rightfully acknowledges, we now face the renewed threat of competition from Russia and China, and we cannot ignore their investments in nuclear weapons in addition to conventional forces. The 2018 Nuclear Posture Review reaffirms the findings of previous reviews that the Nuclear Triad, comprised of silo-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, bomber aircraft, and nuclear submarines, is the most strategically sound means of ensuring nuclear deterrence. To remain effective, however, we must recapitalize our Cold War legacy nuclear deterrent forces, continuing a modernization program initiated during the previous administration. To quote my predecessor, Secretary Carter, quote, "We have been in a nuclear arms race for 2 decades now, but the U.S. hasn't been running the race," unquote. And as you can see demonstrated in this chart over here in the corner of the room, that gives credence to my predecessor's observation, the nuclear delivery system development over the last 8 years shows numerous advances by Russia, by China, and by North Korea versus the near absence of such activity by the United States, with competitors and adversaries developing 34 new systems in that time as compared to only 1 for the U.S., the F-35 aircraft. Nuclear deterrence will continue to play a critical role in preventing nuclear attack and large-scale conventional warfare between nuclear-armed states for the foreseeable future. U.S. nuclear weapons assure and defend our allies against conventional and nuclear threats, furthering our non-proliferation goals and increasing global security. The National Defense Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review align with the President's national security strategy, guiding all of our efforts. As I said earlier, no strategy can survive without the necessary stable, predictable funding. Failure to modernize our military risks leaving us with a force that could dominate the last war, but be irrelevant to tomorrow's security. We need Congress to lift the defense spending caps and support the budget for our military of $700 billion for this fiscal year and $716 billion for next fiscal year. Let me be clear, as hard as the last 16 years of war have been on our military, no enemy in the field has done as much to harm the readiness of the U.S. military than the combined impact of the Budget Control Act's defense spending caps, worsened by operating for 10 of the last 11 years under continuing resolutions of varied and unpredictable duration. The Budget Control Act was purposely designed to be so injurious that it would force Congress to pass necessary budgets. It was never intended to be the solution. For too long, we have asked our military to carry on stoically with a success at any cost attitude. Our troops work tirelessly to accomplish every mission with increasingly inadequate and misaligned resources simply because Congress has not maintained regular order. The fact that our volunteer military has performed so well is a credit to their dedication and professionalism. We expect the men and women of our military to be faithful in their service, even when going in harm's way. We must also remain faithful to them. Chairman, as you said in January, if Congress does not come together to find a way to fund this strategy, Secretary Mattis must explicitly inform Congress and the American people of the consequences of failure. The consequences of not providing a budget are clear. Even though we are protecting ongoing operations from continuing resolution disruptions, each increment of funding in support of our partners in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria requires a 15-day congressional notification. My commanders in the field write to me for help in getting timely and predictable funds for their efforts as they work to execute our strategy against the enemy in the field. Additionally, should we stumble into a year-long continuing resolution, your military will not be able to provide pay for our troops by the end of the fiscal year. We will not recruit the 15,000 Army soldiers and 4,000 Air Force airmen required to fill critical manning shortfalls. We will not maintain our ships at sea with the proper balance between operations and time in port for maintenance. We will ground aircraft due to a lack of maintenance and spare parts. We will deplete the ammunition, training, and manpower required to deter war and delay contracts for vital acquisition programs necessary to modernize the force. Further, I cannot overstate the impact to our troops' morale from all this uncertainty. Today, as I sit here, we are engaged in prudent planning in the Pentagon for another disruptive government shutdown. You know that I cannot care more about our country's defense than this Congress, for it is Congress alone which has the constitutional authority to raise and support armies and to provide and maintain a Navy. We need Congress back in the driver's seat, not in the spectator's seat of the Budget Control Act's indiscriminate and automatic cuts. I know that in time of a major war, Congress will provide our military with all it needs. But money at the time of crisis fails to deter war. And you know we would be at that point to have no time to prepare, as it takes months and years to produce the munitions, the training, and readiness required to fight well. To carry out the strategy you rightly directed we develop, we need you to pass a budget now. If we are to sustain our military's primacy, we need budget predictability. Congress must take action now to ensure our military's lethality is sufficient to defend our way of life, to preserve the promise of prosperity, and to pass on the freedoms we enjoy to the next generation. And I ask that you not let disagreements on domestic policy continue to hold our nation's defense hostage. General Selva will now discuss the military dimensions of the 2018 National Defense Strategy and our nuclear posture review. Thank you.
General Selva.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Smith and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to join Secretary Mattis to brief on the National Defense Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review. General Dunford and I, along with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, fully support the strategies outlined in the National Defense Strategy and in the Nuclear Posture Review. Both documents are the product of significant consultation and collaboration between members of the Joint Staff and the OSD staff. The National Defense Strategy provides detailed defense policy guidance for military strategy, planning, and operations. Therefore, the Chairman's 2016 Classified National Military Strategy will require an update to maintain complete consistency with the National Defense Strategy and the President's National Security Strategy released in December. Immediately upon release of the National Defense Strategy, published last month, General Dunford directed the Joint Staff to commence a revision of the National Military Strategy, and that process is now underway. Other subsequent guidance and plans will be revised in turn to support the lines of effort outlined in the National Defense Strategy and to operationalize the concept of dynamic force employment. Additionally, we have begun to review the Joint Staff's organization and processes to determine if we need to make adjustments to support the Chairman's global integrator responsibilities and to better position the Chairman to support the Secretary's decision-making processes. Refining the National Military Strategy and the Joint Staff's organization and processes are a step towards increasing the lethality and flexibility of the Joint Force in light of the reemergence of great power competitions. The Nuclear Posture Review also reflects the realities of today's security environment, as well as projecting the future environment and its potential impacts on U.S. nuclear weapons policy and strategy. More specifically, the Nuclear Posture Review paid particular attention to Russian, Chinese, and North Korean activities intended to develop, modernize, and expand their nuclear weapons capabilities and to integrate them into their military strategies and doctrine. The Nuclear Posture Review takes into account the potential for Iran to renew its pursuit of nuclear weapons and capability in the future. The review has determined that our strategy must be tailored to each of these potential adversaries to effectively communicate the costs of aggression, and this tailored strategy approach requires that the United States maintain a flexible and credible mix of nuclear and conventional capabilities that can address a spectrum of adversaries and threats over a significant period of time. It should not be lost on this committee that the Nuclear Posture Review conducted its assessment across a 30-year swath of the future. The Nuclear Posture Review reaffirms the nation's nuclear triad as the bedrock of our ability to deter aggression, assure our allies, and hedge against an uncertain future. And as the Secretary has mentioned, it reaffirms the need to recapitalize each component of our legacy nuclear systems to ensure that our nuclear capabilities remain ready, secure, capable, and credible now and into the future. Two supplemental capabilities recommended in the Nuclear Posture Review, the nuclear-armed sea-launched cruise missile and a modification of a small number of existing submarine-launched ballistic missile warheads, would enhance deterrence by ensuring that no adversary, under any set of circumstances, can perceive an advantage through the use of a limited nuclear escalation or other strategic attack. Fielding these capabilities will not lower the threshold at which the U.S. would employ nuclear weapons. Rather, it will raise the nuclear threshold for potential adversaries, making the use of nuclear weapons less likely. Nuclear weapons pose the only existential military threat to our nation. Therefore, there is no higher priority for the joint force than fielding all of the components of an effective nuclear deterrent to deter potential adversaries from nuclear attack on any scale. It is important to note that the National Defense Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review both make the assumption that the military will receive timely, predictable, and sufficient funding to execute these strategies. As General Mattis has emphasized, we in uniform appreciate the support of this committee and the Congress, and we trust that the Congress will provide the funding needed to turn these strategies into reality. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith, thank you for your time. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Let me just take a moment and give members a heads up on what our schedule looks like today. We're going to have votes on the floor about 11:30. The Secretary and General Selva were gracious to move the start time of this hearing up to 9:30 to try to give us more time to get in questions before the votes. But we're still not going to have time to get to everybody. So we're going to do the best we can until we have votes. We're going to break and go to the floor, and then we will reconvene after votes in a closed classified session so that we can get further details about the national security strategy. Now, the Secretary still has to be over in the Senate later today, so, but I think that's the best combination of things to give us the most useful information in both public and in a classified session. Ms. Secretary, I was sitting here thinking that I believe the statement you just gave is the clearest, most direct, bluntest statement I've heard from any administration witness about the importance of Congress doing its job in a way that Mr. Smith and I both talked about in our opening statements. And you were very clear about CRs and the damage they do to the military. Later today, the House is going to vote on an appropriation bill for the Department of Defense for the rest of the fiscal year. It is consistent with about $700 billion of total spending for our national defense account. And my question to you is that bill, that level of funding, consistent with the national defense strategy that you have talked about today? And if for whatever reason that level of resources does not happen, what does that do to the strategy?
Chairman, that is sufficient. I would tell you, sir, that with it we can restore the competitive advantage or begin down the trail of restoring the competitive advantage that has been eroded. I would tell you additionally, sir, that without it, we will be put into the position where the strategy would have to be changed and we would have to accept greater risk, especially in terms of deterring adversaries who might think that we are weaker because they can register where our readiness is being eroded.
Okay. Let me just ask one other thing in the interest of time so we can get to other members. When you assumed this office, there was speculation, perhaps, that you were a skeptic on some aspects of our nuclear triad, our nuclear deterrence. You spent a year looking through it. The Nuclear Posture Review is the result of the study that you and the department have put into it. But can you just kind of tell us what, as you have looked at our nuclear deterrence, how has your thinking evolved? I mean, I don't know if you want to say if you were a skeptic or not at the beginning, but it looks like there was a change or at least some evolution. Why?
I think that's a fair statement, Chairman. I was confident that when I received the waiver from the House and the Senate to go into this job that you expected me to exercise my judgment. I came in wanting to challenge just about everything. I wanted it to be proven to me that we needed to spend every cent, that every time we had a troop in harm's way, it was for the well-being of the American people. In this case, I looked at the triad piece by piece and the elements of each leg of the triad. I was especially attentive to the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile Force. After talking with a lot of people, visiting the missile fields, and doing a lot of study, I believe it is a stabilizing element that would be a strong deterrent to anyone who decided they wanted to employ nuclear weapons against us. There was another weapon system that I was concerned could be destabilizing, an air-launched cruise missile, or a cruise missile you can see over here on the chart that clearly Russia does not consider that destabilizing. Look at the number that they have developed and fielded. And as I put together, how do we keep us in a position where this is a nuclear deterrent? It's got to have those capabilities to be most persuasive. Deterrence is in the eye of the adversary. And that was the journey I embarked on. And it was a little rough on the staff and those who came in promoting it at first. But I think they were compelling by the time we were done.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you are quite correct that we have entered an era where great power rivalry is back on the table. Obviously, China and Russia have become more active in a variety of different ways. What disturbs me about the direction of this conversation is I don't believe that great power rivalry equals endless arms race. That basically whenever you have a great power rivalry, all that is involved is military power. You have to build as much as you can build, they have to build as much as they build, and it goes up and up and up and up and up. Would you agree, Mr. Secretary, that there are other important elements of dealing with great power rivalry, starting, for instance, with the State Department, with diplomacy, with the idea that dialogue between our adversaries, between us and our adversaries is important?
Congressman Smith, I would agree 100%, and I would point out we are not developing, for example, nuclear torpedoes. Our nation is quite capable of developing new weapons, as you know, and unlike Russia, for example, we have chosen not to do that to give opportunity for our diplomats to do what you're recommending.
My question is, deterrence is also your diplomatic stance. Deterrence is dialogue. And this is what concerns me is, yes, we have to be able to deter Russia and China from moving forward. But part of the way you deter them, particularly in the nuclear arena, is to have a dialogue, to do what Ronald Reagan did with Gorbachev and with others, and not just arms reduction, but at least have an open discussion so that you don't miscalculate. I mean, a lot of what we're building into here is we're assuming that the Russians, gosh, if we don't have low-yield nuclear weapons, then the Russians will think that they can get away with a low-yield nuclear strike. Part of the way that you make sure that they don't think that is you let them know. You have a dialogue. And I'm very concerned right now that we don't have much in the way of a dialogue with Russia or China. We did get something in the DOD bill that we passed this year that would mandate that happening, but we mandate a lot of things that the executive branch doesn't do. So we need to do that. But on the larger point, essentially what we're presented with, what the chairman has presented us with is we have to cut taxes massively, of course. So we've done that. And then we have to fund defense. So when you go back through those numbers that I mentioned on a $21 trillion debt and $700 billion deficit that is growing, now we're going to have a massive increase in defense. We had the massive tax cut. You are going to gut everything else. And let's forget for the moment our infrastructure, education, things that are, I think, also important to actually having a just and prosperous society. Defense is important, without question. But if you gut everything else, you create problems. And let's just focus on security. If we pass this budget that the Republicans want to put before us today, the State Department will continue to be destroyed. As we all know, career diplomats are leaving. There have been massive cuts in their budget, and now we are proposing no budget for the State Department. We'll give them a CR. We're not going to pay any attention to that whatsoever. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, okay? How do we know we have to build massive weapons to deter Russia and China? Well, we're not talking to them, so we have to presume the worst. We're going to give up on diplomacy and simply focus on having as many weapons as is humanly possible to make sure that they're deterred. Dialogue is incredibly important to deterrence, and not just dialogue with Russia and China. We need allies. Look, if we are in a great power rivalry in this world with both Russia and China, given our massive debt and China's economic might, that's going to be a tough hill to climb. I mean, we could build a military, trillion-dollar military, and it's going to be hard to match all of that. We need allies. We need friends. And there are a lot of possibilities. India, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan. We still don't even have an ambassador to South Korea. But we are degrading diplomacy at an incredibly rapid level. We are also degrading development, which I think is an important part of it. This is part of how we talk about, all that stuff in the charter there that China is doing. One of the biggest things China is doing is they're spending a ton of money all across the world to try to curry favor with countries and also build their own economic might. Now, they're doing it in an incredibly crass and terrible way because they don't care what the government does. They're not going to pull money out of a country because of a human rights violation. They don't care. They're doing it. We're pulling back. Again, this budget that is being proposed guts development. And then let's just talk about the Department of Homeland Security. Passingly important, I would hope, for our national security. It is part of the non-defense discretionary budget. it too will be gutted by this approach. We'll just leave it in the wind in the CR because defense takes priority, we do nothing else. The Justice Department has played an enormous role in stopping terrorist attacks and also bringing to justice those who have committed them. It too gets gutted by this budget. So I always bristle a little bit when I hear the, how can we hold defense hostage to domestic political priorities, as if those domestic political priorities were some kind of luxury that, we just engage in for fun and enjoyment and aren't really important. All of those things are important. The State Department is really important. In fact, I don't think it was you, but I think it was your predecessor or someone who said, I think it was you, said, if you're going to cut the State Department, you better give me 5 more divisions, okay? Because that's what I'm going to need to defend this country. It was either you or General Dunford. I apologize. So to sit here and say, we're going to stand up, spend all this money on defense because it would just be wrong to prioritize other things is patently absurd and insulting. Defense is incredibly important. It's not the only thing that's important in keeping the peace. This is more speech than a question, but I think it's important. You got to agree, there are other things that are important than keeping the peace. And if we do what is being proposed today, we say to those other things, they don't matter. Department of Homeland Security doesn't matter. Department of Justice doesn't matter. State Department doesn't matter. None of that matters. Doesn't that make your job vastly more difficult? That was a question.
Congressman Smith, I take no issue with the fact that we need to have regular order across all government expenditures. Unfortunately, right now, what we're doing is we're creating security vulnerabilities that can no longer be denied. Again, one look at the chart and you can see where we're at. We cannot do new starts. We cannot get into cyber protection of the very things that you hold dear. Because we do not have the ability to do so under continuing resolutions 9 of the last 10 years. I don't think there's anything contradictory in the way you and I look at this right now. Secretary Tillerson and I have a very close working relationship. Our military operations are wrapped firmly inside our foreign policy, and the President has directed Secretary Tillerson and I to find ways to engage on non-proliferation and arms control. Right now, we have constant communication with the Russians on what I would call operational matters, counterterrorism, for example, North Korea. But some of these are on pretty big issues. But I agree that we need more communication with Russia, with China, along the level of, I would almost call it philosophical engagement, as well as operational matters. And I don't think there's anything at all ill-advised about making certain the protection of the country is put foremost, so the country can do all the other things that you were referring to.
I guess foremost is okay. Only, exclusively, while ignoring everything else, not okay. And that's what we're about to do this afternoon. So the only contradictory thing is to completely ignore the rest of the budget, massively cut taxes and fund defense, and act like you've provided for security for the country. A lot of other people got to get in. I made my point. I appreciate you answering the question. I yield back.
Just for the record, I hope we get a complete budget agreement, and we do it this week for all aspects of the government. We can do that, and we should. Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to talk about the graveyard of empires. I think that's what they say about Afghanistan and the history of Afghanistan. Mr. Secretary, a few headlines from the last 2 weeks. Kabul attacks cloud U.S.-Afghan strategy. Why are we still shedding our soldiers' blood for pedophiles? Subtitle, the full extent of child sexual assault committed by Afghan security forces may never be known. Another heading, the Taliban is gaining strength and territory in Afghanistan. Another headline, Taliban threatens 70% of Afghanistan. Last headline, Pentagon blocks release of key data on Afghan war. The Pentagon has restricted the release of critical information on the progress being made in the war in Afghanistan a move that will limit transparency. In your prepared remarks, you very kindly said, we need to build the trust of the American people. How can we build the trust of the American people after 16 years, over 2,300 Americans killed, over 20,000 wounded, and we spent $1 trillion? I don't have to add to Mr. Smith's comments, but this country is headed for bankruptcy. Mr. Trump campaigned. I have 30 of his comments and tweets. He was opposed to being in Afghanistan. He wanted to pull out. He was very critical of those who wanted to stay. We are now increasing the number of our troops in Afghanistan, and after 16 years, the American people have a right to know of the successes. Some of that, I'm sure, is classified information, which I can understand. But I also know that we're not getting the kind of information that we need to get to know what successes we're having. And after 16 years, I do not think we're having any successes. I would love to have a classified hearing. Maybe that'll happen in a couple of hours, and you would be able to tell us of some benchmarks that we have made after 16 years. A friend of yours is a friend of mine, the former Commandant of the Marine Corps, Chuck Krulak. He has been my unofficial advisor on Afghanistan for 5 years. Previous Secretary of Defenses have gotten questions that he asked me to ask during hearings like this one. Not today did I get that from him. But 3 or 4 months ago, when you talked about increasing the number of troops in Afghanistan, he sent me a 5-paragraph email. I'm certainly only going to read one sentence, and then I want to ask you the question. No one has ever conquered Afghanistan, and many have tried. We will join the list of nations that have tried and failed. Mr. Secretary, how can we, with this budget situation we've got and an economic collapse in this country, how can we continue to go on a policy after 16 years when the Secretary of Defense that follows you and the congressman that follows me or congresswoman, if we're still talking about Afghanistan and the future and nothing is changing, I think there's got to be a time that you would say to President Trump, we have done all we can do. Blood and treasure is lost, and we have nothing to show that we've gained, except we still have trouble with the leaders of Afghanistan having sex with little boys. Give me a quick response if you can.
Congressman, if we were engaged in conquering Afghanistan, I would agree 100% with what you just stated, if that was our sense of empire. In fact, what we are doing to earn the trust of the American people is to ensure another 9/11 hatched out of there does not happen during our watch. Further, the strategy we put together, and President Trump challenged every assumption. It took months to put it together, to answer every question he had, and the gravity of protecting the American people caused him to change his mind based on what the intelligence services told him was the vulnerability we would have if we pulled out of there. That strategy did permit a more regional approach. It has been embraced by nations as diverse as those in NATO and India. We had declined to 39 nations fighting in the NATO campaign from 50 years ago. It has gone now to 41. It has started growing more allies. They're there because they believe in the strategy, which means the Afghan boys continue to carry the load for the fighting, but now with advisors that bring the NATO air support and fire support to bear to help them. The Taliban, Haqqani, they have not made their pitch to the Afghan people in a positive way by murdering innocent people. They are not incurring the support of the Afghan people, whereas NATO does have that support. It's been a long, hard slog, and I recognize that, but I would also tell you that any attempt to keep information from the American people. It was a NATO decision at that point. It was a mistake, I might add, and that information is now available. A number of those headlines, obviously, are selected by their editors in order to make the storyline they have. We believe that the regionalized strategy will draw even more allies, and it puts the enemy on the path towards accepting reconciliation. We're not out to conquer it.
Time of the gentleman's more than expired. I just mentioned to members, you can ask whatever you want to, but if you ask a question for 4 minutes and leave the secretary less than a minute to offer, I'm not going to cut him off, but we're not going to get very far if that's the approach. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both of you for your service and for being here this morning. I wanted to associate myself with the ranking member's comments regarding the whole of government approach that is so critical. I know that Secretary Mattis, you mentioned too that we must negotiate from a position of strength so that our military capability should be clear and send that message. But at the same time, we know how long it takes to develop high-ranking officers who can provide our country with the best of advice, and we must have that same timeline for the State Department and for those individuals that negotiate, whether it's in commerce or whatever realm that it is. So I wanted to just go to the issue of lowering the threshold in terms of nuclear capability. And there is a question whether or not the nuclear posture review is clear on what it considers to be lowering the threshold versus some of the comments that I think General Selva made, that it is possible to modernize nuclear capability and at the same time lower that threshold as it's perceived by our adversaries. Can you speak to that more? Because I think we're all concerned about the Russian doctrine of escalating to de-escalate. Where are we, and how can we make that clear, I think, to the American people?
I think part of it can be addressed through the continuity of our nuclear deterrent, and again, I never say nuclear deterrent strategy and how we manage it and how we talk about it. And if you look at the 2010 nuclear posture review, in which it said we would only use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances, I would refer to 2018, where we say in the most extreme circumstances would we use those weapons. You see the continuity between two different administrations, two different political parties for the president. And in regards to the lower yield weapon, it's to make certain that no one thinks that they could use a low yield weapon and put us in a position where we could only respond with a high-yield weapon with the supposition that maybe we would not. And we can say, well, we know we would, but what matters in deterrence is what does the adversary think? And in this regard, deterrence is dynamic, and we must recognize that today's deterrent must keep pace with the thinking of today's adversaries or competitors.
Could you respond, sir, though, to the belief that a nuclear weapon is a nuclear weapon, that no matter what that size may be, it would still signal that we're using a nuclear weapon and perhaps even changing the rules of the game?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree. I don't think there's any such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Any nuclear weapon used any time is a strategic game changer. That said, we don't want someone else to miscalculate and think because they're going to use a low-yield weapon that somehow we would confront what Dr. Kissinger calls surrender or suicide. That we do not want even an inch of daylight to appear in how we look at the nuclear deterrent. It is a nuclear deterrent and must be considered credible.
Thank you. General Selva as well. I mean, looking at that nuclear modernization, the cost, $700 billion, $1.5 trillion, is that something that, given the whole scope of what's needed in terms of our defense budget, that makes sense today?
My response is yes, it does make sense. It makes sense in the context that we're talking across about a 40-year time span. the cost of about $700 million to modernize the three legs of the triad to make available to future Secretaries of Defense and Commanders-in-Chief a credible, secure, reliable nuclear triad that allows those individuals 20 or 30 years into the future to be able to tailor strategic responses as well as support the possibility of negotiating away entire types and classes of weapons. That process will have to continue over a long time span. The arsenal and weapons that we have today are ready, secure, and credible, but they must be modernized over the span of time to keep those options available to our commanders-in-chief.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Wilson.
And Secretary Mattis, General Selva, thank you so much for your service and in being here today. I especially appreciate what you're doing as a veteran myself, but particularly as a grateful dad. I've had 4 sons and a nephew serve overseas in Iraq, Afghanistan, Egypt, Army, Navy, Air Force. And so I'm just very, very grateful for your service and your leadership. It's so reassuring as a military parent. Secretary Mattis, your Nuclear Posture Review, NPR, recommends that the U.S. develop 2 supplemental nuclear capabilities. First, a low-yield submarine-launched ballistic missile, SLBM, and second, a sea-launched cruise missile. Why are these needed for deterrence and assurance? And following on that, some are arguing that they lower the threshold for the U.S. to use nuclear weapons. Do you believe that the addition of these capabilities to the U.S. nuclear arsenal is an increase or decrease the likelihood of a nuclear war? And in another angle, why should we need a low-yield SLBM when we already have a low-yield nuclear gravity bomb? Are these capabilities redundant?
Congressman, I don't believe it lowers the threshold at all. What it does, it makes very clear that we have a deterrent. If the Russians choose to carry out what some of their doctrine people have promoted, their political leaders have promoted, which would be to employ a low-yield nuclear weapon in a conventional fight in order to escalate, to de-escalate. In other words, to escalate to victory and then de-escalate. We want to make certain they recognize that we can respond in kind. We don't have to go with a high-yield weapon, thus the deterrent effort stays primary. It is not to in any way lower the threshold to use nuclear weapons. On the sea-launched cruise missile, as you know, we have an ongoing issue with Russia's violation of the INF. I want to make certain that our negotiators have something to negotiate with, that we want Russia back into compliance. We do not want to forego the INF, but at the same time, we have options if Russia continues to go down this path. So the idea is, once again, to keep our negotiators negotiating from a position of strength. I don't believe you can go into a negotiation and try to get something for nothing. I don't think the Russians would be willing to give up something to gain nothing from us in terms of reduction.
Well, if there's any negotiation, I certainly have faith in your capabilities, and we look forward to working with you. Another issue that's so important, and Mr. Secretary, that needs to be restated over and over, you referenced it in your opening statement, but is there any stronger indication of Congress's resolve, any action with better deterrent value to peer competitors than repealing the Budget Control Act sequestration and supporting our military with adequate and reliable funding?
No, there is not, Congressman. The U.S. Congress speaks for the American people. I would probably send the most stabilizing and sobering message that this democracy will stand up for itself.
And an issue that Chairman Thornberry has been leading on is to address our readiness issue. As we're here just 2 days from another government shutdown, can you tell, in your view, if Congress does not do its part to turn this crisis around, can we expect to see further impacts to the military? Should we anticipate more accidents, tragic accidents, as we saw in the Pacific this year with the Fitzgerald and McCain?
Congressman, we are doing everything possible to avoid any such repeats of those accidents. However, there are a number of areas where when time is lost, if you have pilots who are not taking in their flying time now, 5 years from now, when they're majors or they're lieutenant colonels, they will not have the level of expertise we would expect because they did not get the opportunity that they lost during continuing resolutions or during budget shutdowns, governmental shutdowns. It impacts us. And so it's not like we maintain even the status quo if we go into one of these kind of situations yet again. We actually lose ground, and I can go on for a number of examples in all the forces.
Thank both of you for your service.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, and General Selva, thank you for your service and for your testimony here today. I also want to associate myself with the comments of the ranking member when it comes to taking a whole-of-government approach to funding our national security priorities as well. But I want to turn to another aspect of a security challenge that faces our country today. Mr. Secretary, it's an accepted fact that our planet's climate is changing. You acknowledge this yourself to our committee, and you've shown leadership in this regard, submitting at your confirmation hearing that you will, and I quote, ensure that the Department continues to be prepared to conduct operations today and in the future, and that we are prepared to address the effects of a changing climate on our threat assessments, resources, and readiness. And I want to commend you for those statements. However, both the President's national security strategy and the Department's national defense strategy fail to note climate change as a threat. I'm perplexed by that and certainly ask why was that omitted, but as these changes occur, how will you ensure the Department is prepared to respond? What steps will the Department take to mitigate the challenges of a changing land and seascape to ensure America's mission resiliency and assurance?
Congressman, on a military level, every base we have has what we call extreme weather plans. We acknowledge any kind of environmental impacts from the weather, whether it be drainage systems or whatever we need in order to keep that base operating, whether it be airfields, seaports, marshaling bases for deployment, that sort of thing. This is a normal part of what the military does, and under any strategy, it is part and parcel.
Well, I still find it perplexing that it was left out of the national defense strategy. General Selva, let me turn to part of your testimony. I might take issue just with one part of it, where you say nuclear weapons pose the only existential military threat to our nation. I would add cyber weapons as also posing an existential and asymmetric threat to our nation as well. In your assessment, both to you and to the Secretary, how well resourced and trained are our forces to deal with the threats of cybersecurity?
Congressman, we've established U.S. Cyber Command as the bulwark for the military networks that we operate on in order to be able to defend the nation. Cybercom, in consultation and collaboration with the National Security Administration, also provides for some of the cybersecurity for critical infrastructure and industries around the country. My point in saying that nuclear weapons represent the only military existential threat is that they would be used uniquely for military purposes to threaten us and cause us to capitulate or surrender in the face of a military threat. There's no question that cyber is an asymmetric capability, and this nation has vulnerabilities both in critical infrastructure as well as civilian infrastructure, and we will continue to do the work of normalizing our ability to defend those and provide the kinds of advice we can through the National Security Agency as well as Department of Justice and Department of Homeland Security to defend those networks.
Do you feel that our training is meeting expectations as to where we need to be at this time to deal with our cyber challenges?
Sir, collaboration between both the military capabilities to defend our networks and Department of Homeland Security, Justice, and NSA to defend national networks. The training's as good as we can possibly make it, and we're reacting to the threats that we can see.
Mr. Secretary, the National Defense Strategy states that interstate strategic competition rather than terrorism is now the primary national security concern. It's also our eroding. It also notes our eroding competitive military advantage should diplomacy and deterrence fail. While I agree that we must increase our military edge in the event of future conflict, today our competitors are launching political, economic, information, and cyber operations targeting us. Where do you believe we are with respect to our competitive advantage in these types of activities that do not rise to the level of armed conflict? To what extent do you feel we should be prepared to increase our proficiency in these areas?
Yeah, it's a great question, sir, because this was what I was alluding to when I mentioned that we have the potential to enlarge the competitive space, and it's right into the areas you're talking about. We have to remember we are a revolutionary act, this country, the kind of democracy that we stand for. And you can practice all the predatory economics you want. You can send your military into Syria to prop up a despot if you wish to. But the fact is we have areas of diplomacy, of education that go far beyond what other nations can reach back and find strength in. And we can use that to build modern partnerships. In other words, not abandon our traditional partnerships, NATO, for example, but certainly expand to a broader array of partners today that do not want to be basically made tribute states to someone else's economic or political system.
Thank you both, and I yield back.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you both for being here. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your strong statements here today. I've got two thank yous and a question, and I'm going to yield the remainder of my time to Mr. Gallagher. Chairman said we're in tough time constraints, and so not everyone's going to be able to answer a question. The two thank yous are, one, thank you for your strong statements on the budget. I voted against the Budget Control Act because I believe that sequestration would be damaging to our military and that it would happen. And certainly everyone in this committee has fought ever since it's been implemented to try to lift that burden on our military. Your strong words are important to let people know the real effects of that. It's very sad that in your comments you have a whole section on impact of congressional inaction. But I must say that the House has not really been inactive. We passed a budget, the National Defense Authorization Act. We passed the appropriation bills 3 times. We're going to do it again. We really are dealing with a handful of those in the Senate who are causing inaction, and I certainly call on Democratic leadership in the Senate to dislodge the defense funding for the military because of the various reasons that you're giving us of the damage that's occurring by connecting defense funding to other items. Secondly, I want to thank you for your strong words in the Nuclear Posture Review. We know we're coming off the 2010 Obama Nuclear Posture Review that actually assigned DOD the responsibility of reducing the role of U.S. nuclear weapons in U.S. national security strategy, while at the same time giving the responsibility to modernize. It's very hard to reduce at the same time to modernize. Your chart is important because it certainly over here on the right shows that those who say that we need to reduce our nuclear weapons or slow our modernization because others will follow is folly. Our reducing our nuclear weapons does not result in anyone else doing so. It certainly is not based on reality or history. One correction, on the bottom right on your chart, you say air-launched and the F-35. As you know, we're not, that's on paper currently. That's not an accomplished capability. I look forward to working with you on that. Then to my question, you indicated that the INF Treaty was continuing to be violated by Russia, and we're continuing in a dialogue. We also know that they violated the territorial integrity of a treaty with the Ukraine. They violated the Open Skies Treaty, violating the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe. How do we approach their violation in the INF in dialogue when they show no indication that treaties even matter to them?
Well, sir, I've had extensive discussions with our NATO allies and the Secretary General at NATO on this issue. I've made clear that our approach is that we do not want to withdraw from INF, but we're going to have to see effort by Russia to get back in line with it. And this is, State Department is engaged on this with the Russians as we speak right now. And also, we are going to stay inside the INF compliant requirements, but we are going to do research and development of an alternative weapon that should put Russia in a position to see the value to returning to be an INF compliant.
You yield to Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Chairman Turman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your tough words today and for your hard work on the National Defense Strategy, particularly its focus on great power competition. As we try to operationalize that new focus, I'm particularly interested in some of the second-order consequences where we might need to shift our thinking in order to stay ahead of our competitors. And you recently endorsed the Foreign Investment Risk Review Modernization Act, and you've talked about China's pursuit of veto authority over other nations' economic decisions. Why, in your view, is this legislation and a hard look at CFIUS needed?
Sir, we have made very keen observations of the amount of intellectual property that has been basically under industrial espionage, has been rifled through in our country and exfiltrated. And it's time that we also look at what are the most critical national security industries that may not be covered under the current act, that we need to broaden and deepen the protections for this advantage that we have available, whether it be Silicon Valley, Seattle, or elsewhere in the country.
And then can I quickly ask General Selva, what concerns do you have from a military advice perspective on our ability to protect DoD's supply chain, critical technology, and our industrial base, given current tools, practices, and authorities?
Thank you, Congressman. The supply chain and the industrial base speak directly to the timeliness of CFIUS actions in our ability to control who invests in those key capabilities that allow us to supply, train, and deploy our military forces. So the notion that we wouldn't pay attention to who's investing in the companies that actually allow us to move and mobilize our force is folly. So the refinement and renewal of the powers within the CFIUS capabilities to determine who is doing that investing and for what reason put us in a position of being able to understand the potential vulnerabilities of those investments.
Thank you both. My time has expired.
Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I couldn't help but notice in the response to a question earlier, you said that I think I heard you say that we need SLCM and the SLBM in order to have democracy stand up for itself. I think that's what your response was to a question. You're not suggesting that if any one of us don't support the development of SLCM or SLBM that we're not standing up for our democracy?
That would never be the way I characterize someone's vote, sir.
Thank you. So you also argued that in the nuclear posture review it provides I think it was SLCM provides a bargaining chip in dealing with the INF treaty violations of the Russians. Is that, did I get that correct?
That's correct,
yeah, okay.
Congressman.
Is it a logical extension then that if we saw a change in Russian behavior, the administration would stop the development of the either one or both?
I don't want to say in advance of a negotiation and undercut our negotiators' position what we would or would not do. The point I would make is that deterrence is dynamic. We have to deal with it as it stands today, as we see it on the chart. And in that regard, I believe that we have to give our negotiators something with which to negotiate.
Do you have any indication there would be a change in Russian behavior with the development of either one of these?
I can only tell you that we go into this with capabilities to make certain the Russians understand that we have a capability, in a deterrent capability, and it's based on not just the two nations, but the broader deterrent portfolio as well.
Sure. Does the U.S. currently have the ability to deliver a non-strategic nuclear weapon, a nuclear response without this investment? Do you have the ability, I'm sorry, do you have the ability to deliver that without this investment?
Are you referring to a sea-launched cruise missile?
No, I'm talking about the delivery of a non-strategic nuclear response.
I would be cautious about saying any nuclear weapon is non-strategic, sir. If you mean a low yield, yes, we do.
And what's the difference between that capability and, say, a sea launch?
The gravity bomb that is the low yield means the bomber would have to penetrate, but today air defense systems are altogether different than 10 or 20 years ago.
And is there any investment going on in counter air defense to deal with that, or is this the is the development of a new capability the only solution?
No, no, sir. We are certainly working on air defense penetration capability, but again, we have to deal with where we're at today. We are working on the issue.
Yeah, it's kind of the where we're at question gets to something I'm not going to bore you with the details because we'll probably get to it in subcommittee hearings, but the CBO estimate of now $1.2 trillion over 30 years, which I think the department would say, for the nuclear modernization, which the department would say is only or merely 6.4% of the budget when it was much higher in the past. I don't know if that means the rest of the defense budget is out of control and this one's under control, or the fact that we don't really have an accounting of what that $1.2 trillion is, and that we are now looking at an NPR that presumes additional development of capabilities, which I presume would be on top of this current CBO estimate. You can maybe address that briefly, but we're going to have plenty of time over the next couple of months to explore that, the money question all the time, and people then work against me. So I'm just wondering, has NATO then yet taken a position, and I'll follow up with you later on that. Thanks a lot.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your attendance and your service to the country. The last nuclear posture review published 8 years ago said, quote, "Russia is not an enemy and is increasingly a partner," close quote. At that time, there were many of us on this committee who didn't believe that statement, and we certainly don't today. Russia continues to brazenly violate the INF Treaty, continues to conduct dangerous nuclear exercises directed against the United States, NATO allies, and regional partners, and continues a military occupation of sovereign Ukrainian territory. Finally, China clearly demands recognition as a regional gatekeeper and a global influence. With that backdrop, Secretary Mattis, how would you characterize the changes we've seen in global security environment since the 2010 NPR, and why do these changes matter, and how is your NPR recommending we adapt our nuclear posture and policies?
Yes, sir. I believe what we've seen is that Russia and China, from, as you point out, Ukraine, to mucking around in our elections in the case of democratic elections in the case of Russia, to China's militarization of features in the South China Sea. We have seen them choose to become strategic competitors with us, vice what at one time we had hoped would be some level of partnership.
Do you believe that the 6 or 7% of our defense budget that we are devoting to the nuclear enterprise is an adequate level of spending to fund our nation's #1 priority defense mission?
I do believe it is, and I would point out that it's around 3.5% for many years, climbing to 6.5, 6.7 at its top percentage about 2029, we believe, and at that point it would go into a more measured maintenance of what we have built, the Columbia class, the B-21, this sort of thing, Congressman.
Okay, thank you. With that, I yield back.
Ms. Bardallo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, and General Selva. Thank you for your testimony. Mr. Secretary, in the National Defense Strategy, you noted that we are a resilient joint force in regards to our forward deployed forces. I am concerned regarding the U.S. Navy's ability to remain resilient during conflict with a peer adversary, specifically with depot-level ship repair capability in the Pacific. Now, in the Fleet Comprehensive Review, the Navy identified capacity issues at the ship repair facility in Yokosuka, Japan. The FY 2018 NDAA, Section 1047, requires the Secretary of the Navy to submit a report on the ship depot maintenance capability in the Western Pacific. It further requires the Secretary of Defense to certify to Congressional Defense Committees whether or not the current ship depot maintenance capability and capacity, including dry docks in the Western Pacific, are sufficient to meet both peacetime and contingency requirements. So, my question is, where is the department in terms of meeting these requirements, and how are you going about determining if there is sufficient capability and capacity?
Congresswoman, where we're at right now is we're examining the sufficiency of it in terms of just raw capacity, the anticipated need if we go into conflict, and the distribution over a number of locations for obvious reasons. So right now we are still in the assessment. We obviously know what we have right now, but whether it is sufficient for the future is where we're concentrating the study. And I'll make certain that Secretary of the Navy follows up on this as we get more mature in our output.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. The next question I have is that the people of Guam are proud to host the continued bomber presence and one leg of the Nuclear Triad with the recent addition of the B-2 and B-52 bombers. Considering the bomber presence and as the westernmost territory of the United States, Guam holds vital strategic bases, and I'm happy to see the department place a THAAD system to aid in its defense. However, in your strategy, you call for investment on layered missile defense from North Korean threats. Considering our strategic importance, is Guam adequately defended from theater missile threats, and how do you intend to bolster these defense systems in the future?
Well, we will continue bolstering them to keep pace with the threat out of North Korea. As you know, besides the THAAD system, ma'am, we also keep the Aegis, the ballistic missile defense U.S. Navy warship in the waters out there, and we can always reinforce that. We also have several of those ships in Japanese waters right now, and they can move back and forth to include coverage of Guam in the mobile way that comes to our Navy. But we are looking at all the systems to include Aegis ashore as we look toward the future protection of our Pacific area.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I think we've talked about this. Just keep Guam in a secure position and keep all the bombers and everything else you have there for a while anyway. And I thank you again, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Votes have come early. We don't have time to get 2 more members in. So as soon as votes are completed on the floor, we will come back and be in classified session up in 2212. At this point, the open hearing is adjourned.
Secretary Mattis, how are you?
Good to see you, sir.